Hello, everyone. It feels weird coming back from having a day off yesterday. I'm trying to get back in the swing of things. Did everybody? I hope Steve held it down okay. From what I saw, he did. So, bravo, Steve. We have a full house tonight. Mr. Pakman has brought out everyone here in the show. As always, KC here on Tuesdays with Ideology. Hello, KC.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. The sharp gentleman on the far end, Jamie. Welcome back, sir.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm glad to see everybody.
And
Hope you're all doing well.
we are, sir. And the star of the show tonight, also the fine-looking gentleman in the center, Mr. David Pakman. Welcome, sir. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tonight, yes. Go ahead, Casey.
Did you forget Steve? Oh, you started with Steve.
Oh,
Yeah, I started with Steve.
He started with me first. Yeah.
If I did,
Whatever.
though, I would totally do that. That's
He's
totally
tried to
something I would
forget
do.
me before.
I know.
Yeah.
I thought it. I was
He
like,
forgot
oh,
my
he's just
name
acting
once.
like Steve doesn't exist.
I did.
He literally
It was the
forgot my
second
name
show.
once.
It was the second show we ever did, actually, and getting used to the live, the live streaming, it takes a lot because it's not like recording. We recorded the first couple episodes that we did, and you're able to go back and fill in and fix whatever you mess up. So I'm scrambling to try to focus on what I'm going to open up with, and I opened the show and I said, "Hello, everyone. I'm Kyle Curtis, and I'm joined by."
This other guy.
And I'm waiting on Steve to break in. I'm waiting on Steve to break in to save me. Like, obviously, I'm dangling here on a limb, and he just sits there
Let
like,
him
oh, well, he'll get it eventually. So tonight we're going to talk about the death penalty and should it be abolished. This is a kind of a, I guess, roundtable discussion where I'd like to get everybody's thoughts. I know that they vary quite differently between everybody in this call. So I think this is going to be a really good kind of back and forth and getting everybody's ideas out there. From the polls that I put out on Twitter and YouTube and Discord, it's widely varied and a lot more split than I thought it would be. I thought it would be a clear indicator towards, being abolished. That was just my prejudice going in, I guess. But it turns out it's not that simple. And we're going to get into that a little bit later as well. But right now, I'm going to allow Mr. Pakman to say a few words and let you guys know where you can find his show. It's also in the description. But I want to kind of, David, I'm sure everybody watching knows who you are. But just for formality's sake, will you kind of let people know who you are, what you do, and why you do what you do?
Yeah, sure. I host a progressive talk show. It's on close to 200 radio and TV stations. It's the 11 p.m. weekday Eastern time show on Free Speech TV, which is on DirecTV and Dish Network. And then we've got a YouTube channel as well, which now we surpassed about 500,000 subscribers. I think we must be around 525 at this point. Right now, we've got a podcast, and I've been doing it for years. It's my full-time job. It's a show that has number of full-time staffers, and that's what I do 5 days a week.
Busy man. So we definitely appreciate you taking the time to come on and chat with us a bit. And I chose this topic because I just noticed from watching your show, it's something that you would come back to on occasion. It seemed to be kind of I don't know this is just my assumption, but it seems to be like maybe a personal thing with you or something that you're really passionate about. So I thought this might be a good kind of benchmark to start out with. Is that the case?
I mean, is the death personal? It's no more personal than any other political issue, I guess, that I have an opinion about.
Okay, cool. So let's do this then. Let's go down the line here, and so that everybody's clear on where we're coming from in this call, and then we'll kind of jump into it. You guys kind of say what your stance is on it briefly. We'll go into it a little bit deeper, just so everybody kind of gets an idea of where you're coming from. We'll start with you, Casey. Where do you stand on the death penalty being abolished?
I think it should be abolished. I'm against the death penalty.
Okay, Steve.
I don't think we should abolish it. I think it needs to be fixed, but I don't think it should be abolished.
Okay, Jamie.
Yeah, as far as our current justice system exists today, I would absolutely abolish it. But if there was significant reform, I would be for it being implemented in a specific way.
Interesting. That's where I kind of want to start off with tonight. But David, what is your stance on the death penalty?
I'm against it, and I think we should abolish it.
All right, so we're kind of split with Jamie being a kind of in between guy there. So, Jamie, let's start at that middle ground then. When you say if it can be reformed, then you would be for keeping it. What do you mean by that?
First, I want to say I do everything I can to avoid being sandwiched between you and Steve, and here I am again in this exact same.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, I don't think this is more of a dream come true for you, but whatever.
No, so my whole thing is, the short version of this is I'm really sick and tired of the United States giving people exceedingly long prison sentences for really minor crimes in comparison to the amount of time they have to spend in prison. So, for example, Kyle, you actually covered this on one of your Ad Homies episodes where a guy stole fajitas and ended up with 50 years in a federal prison. So my general idea here, and again, I can go into depth later, but my general idea is cap all prison sentences to 10 years. And if it seriously needs more than 10 years, make the death penalty an option. Primarily for the purposes of saving on feeding and housing and clothing a criminal that has no intention of rehabilitating. But I think that should come significantly with a proper understanding of that being the case psychiatric, through psychiatric evaluation. And again, a true justice system, not using the standard we have set today. I make that very clear. If we're going to do things the way we're doing them now, there's no way we'd be capable of ensuring somebody's innocence or guilt. We just do a horrible job of that. So, I take that approach. I would trade having the death sentence for knowing that no prison sentence would be more than 10 years. Let these people get back on with their lives and be reincorporated into society.
Interesting. David, you seem to get a little riled up there.
That's one of the most nonsensical points of view I've maybe ever heard on this issue, and I've done a lot of debates about this. If is it okay if I ask a couple questions to try to figure out a little bit more about what you mean?
Sure.
So,
Jamie,
the forcible rape of a child, would that be in the under 10 years or in the death penalty side?
Well, I'm not the person who's qualified to make that determination. What I'm saying is if it's determined that it deserves more than 10 years by people who are qualified, then it would be a death sentence.
So if I understand correctly, you're saying like the current way it's set up is you're not okay with, right?
You cannot do it. That's why I said it would need massive amounts of reform. What I'm saying is if somebody says you're going to get 3 consecutive, life sentences or, 3, that kind of stuff. It's like, what are we doing here? I mean, there's no
I got you.
real understanding.
But here's what I'm trying to figure. So you've made it clear that the current system as set up by the people who are in charge is not okay. But then when I asked you for your view on a specific case, you said that's for the people who set it up to decide, but you said that those are the people that are doing it wrong, right? So if you're not going to give an example of like that, if that's not one that you can give us a sort of your view on, you want the people who are in charge to give their view, but you're against how they've done it now. So why would you think that they would do it the right way next time?
Because I would implement more. There would be more involved in the process than we have right now. That's why I said, like right now, there is no psychiatric evaluation done to determine the success or failure of possible rehabilitation. It's done through the prison system. It's not done.
What do you mean by that? But the prison system doesn't determine the sentence. So you want psychiatric evaluations in the prison system, but it's the justice system that determines the sentence when someone is found guilty. So why would the prison system having psychiatrists have any bearing on the penalty that's assigned at verdict?
You didn't hear what I said. The psychiatrist would be during this, during the pre-sentencing, would be part of the justice system.
They have that already. They have that already. It's false to say that doesn't exist now. It's used as part of sentencing in countless cases.
Not in terms of the potential for rehabilitation, no.
Absolutely. That's a question that's asked all the time of psychiatrists at sentencing.
Okay. Well, I've never seen it myself. But
Okay. I mean, I've got
what,
that's
I
what
guess.
that to me
Am
is
I
an
reading? Am I
incoherent
reading?
position.
Am I reading your hostility here is a little high for this topic? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's just like it's such a
are you
serious
emotionally involved
thing.
in this?
We did
It is
really, we
serious.
did get really
Oh,
intense
okay.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
really
is
intense.
serious, and it requires a significant amount of maturity to talk about the issues openly. I mean, I'm not at all advocating this on a political platform. I'm not running for office on the position. I'm just discussing it in the sense that one of the things we have that's a major problem in our country is significantly long prison sentences that are unfair and burdensome, and we also have a issue where we have to provide for these long sentences. So what I'm saying is, and then you also get into the deterrence factor. I haven't seen that been completely squashed. That having a death penalty does not provide any deterrence benefit whatsoever. I'm not saying it's the significant amount. I'm just saying that isn't a clear cut yes or no case. So I'm
Right.
just saying if we lived in a society,
Pretty clear cut, I think. But.
You think?
all right, well, share your view. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah.
So
Let's do this then. What's your
Sorry,
solution, David?
My solution is we abolish the death penalty.
Okay.
And have just like however long they're sentenced for, or life sentences, but just basically the system we have now, just no death penalty.
Well, no, there are definitely, I mean, I agree that we have way too long prison sentences for some crimes, like absolutely, for sure. The war on drugs is a disaster. That's 100%, but I see that as totally separate from the death penalty. So I feel like whatever point of view one has politically, there is a good reason that should appeal to that point of view to get rid of the death penalty. So like one of the things that was mentioned was the cost, right? The cost of keeping people in prison for life. That's actually cheaper than the death penalty, because since we get it wrong on the death penalty, unfortunately, too often, people get appeals, right? And that's just something that our justice system affords. Even if you've not been sentenced to death, you still have the opportunity of appeal. Few people want to eliminate that as something that is part of our justice system. As a result of those appeals and the backlog of death row inmates in states that have the death penalty, and the lack of availability of the drugs that will work in a what's called not cruel and not inhumane way, it costs more actually for the death penalty than to just say we're putting someone in prison without the possibility of parole, particularly because those parole hearings also incur a cost. So like if your big thing is cost, you should get rid of the death penalty. If your big thing is for some crimes that are so heinous, we want the worst possible punishment for someone. Putting someone to death and just turning out the lights doesn't even really seem like the worst punishment. The worst punishment to me seems the rest of your life, all you see is the inside of that prison cell. So like if your priority is, and this, it's not mine, but if someone had the priority of, I want the worst possible punishment, it's not just ending it. It's making someone live with the reality that they committed a terrible crime, and now they've got to sit and rot in a cell for the rest of their lives. So these are just a couple examples. I won't go on, but my point is, whatever your political beliefs are, if you have a more libertarian point of view where you think that the government should have as little power as possible because you don't think the government is good at doing stuff, well, then that includes you don't think the government is good at figuring out who's innocent and guilty, and you don't want to give the government the ultimate power of ending people's lives. So I think that's the sort of main point. Whatever politics appeal to any individual, there are really good reasons to be against the death penalty.
And to speak to your point, I put together a list of some facts going towards why it makes sense to abolish the death penalty. And one of those things that you spoke to, we'll take California for example, is they have the largest death row in the country, and they've spent over $4 billion on the death penalty since 1978, while carrying out only 13 executions. So in that length of time, they've spent $4 billion on executing 13 individuals. And that to me, that was one of the things that struck out to me firsthand. We're going to get into the cost of maybe making a mistake and putting someone to death that's innocent. I've got those statistics too, but let's start out with the cost thing. Steve, you came out at the beginning and said that you wouldn't want to abolish it. What's your mind frame for that? What's your mindset there?
Yeah, there's a couple of points to be brought up. One, when you're talking about the cost, most of those costs are because of appeals process, and this goes back to what Jamie's saying of how we need to revamp the whole system. The system is flawed, and Dave, I think, makes some wonderful points when it comes to, do we give the empowerment to a specific group of people to make these decisions? And from an ethical framework, we make those decisions all the time. We always have people that make those decisions for us. Doctors make the decisions of life and death all the time. So if there was a way that Jamie is saying by which we can have some kind of accountability here for what would be something that would be determined to be the death penalty, I'm okay with that. But I think the question that people are missing is, what form of justice are we trying to achieve here? You have retributive justice, you have restorative justice, distributive justice, procedural justice. What is the goal that we're trying to get out of the death penalty? And I think that before we even try to answer the questions if we should abolish it or not, is which one are we looking at? Because I don't agree for retribution we should have the death penalty. I know David had talked about this on a video, that he says that we should not have the death penalty as some type of retribution. I agree. I don't think it's a very effective means for retribution. But what about some of the other means by which we would say this would be an appropriate type of situation for fairness of society, that given that most of us are not committing these heinous crimes this person did, maybe under more procedural type of justice, or I hate to say restorative because nothing's been, you can't bring back the life of a person, right? We can say, if I stole from Jamie, restorative wise, I could be told I have to give him back funds, right? I don't want, no, I'd see retribution or retributive justice is punitive. And I don't think that's a very effective means by which we can address the topic of the death penalty. But I think Jamie has a point. It just requires a lot more sussing out than I think we'll get into in a 2-hour hangout like this, right?
Yeah, and if I can clarify, I was just going to clarify. My point. I don't ever think that the death penalty should be used for the purposes of an ultimate, retribution or punishment. And I do. Well, that's the part of that 10-year prison thing is there's your 10 years for appeal. Now I get that my 10 years is very just thrown out there and to put a dart on the wall, but it's just to get the conversation going. But yeah, thank you, Steve, for recognizing that it needs to be thoroughly thrashed out. It's not that simple.
And I'm gonna let David respond, but before I do, Steve, what is your view as someone that doesn't think that we should abolish it completely? What do you think the best course of justice should be in
I think it should be very limited. Well, it should be very limited in scope. I think that it should only be for the worst heinous crimes, but it should be for the protection of society. If I know that Jamie is a serial killer and he's been executed, there's zero probability of him ever going out and killing another person. That's an effective means by which to protect society. That's the only reason why I would say we would need the death penalty, because people have gone to jail and they still commit murder. They still do crimes, right? I mean, even in the jail system. So if you want to protect society from somebody who does not have these things like compassion or empathy, or even what we would consider to be kind of a soul per se, which I don't believe in, but we think that like a sociopath, we'd say they're soulless, right? They don't care. They have no empathy toward anybody. If that is a person that exists, then I have no compunction by saying we as a society can end their life if it's beneficial to the rest of the society.
Okay, David?
Who gets to determine if it's beneficial to the rest of society?
The people we put in charge for that, same what we do with doctors. There have to be very stringent rules by which we have these types of decisions being made. It wouldn't be your average schmuckatelli, obviously. It's somebody that'd be well-grounded in legal and philosophy.
I'm not sure I understand the analogy to doctors, because you mentioned that a couple times. Maybe we could explore that a little bit. I mean, I think, number one, criminals don't choose to put the justice system in charge of deciding whether they get the death penalty or get life in prison, for example. People are consenting to have doctors treat them, right? So that's kind of like part of the it's part of the way medicine works. I guess we can come up with some like very specific situations where someone is brought into an emergency room and they're non-responsive, and the doctor is sort of deciding that it's an emergency room, we're going to treat someone. But for the most part, like the relationship of someone to a doctor doesn't have anything to do with the relationship of someone to the justice system that determines whether they get life in prison or the death penalty, right? So I guess I'm not sure the relevance of bringing up doctors at all.
Sure.
Steve?
These are ethical considerations, right? When a doctor has to make a life or death decision, they have to take into account the family's wishes. They have to take account the chances of the patient recovering. There's a lot of factors that we give them the empowerment to do because they go through school to be experts on this, to make those decisions. And so every day across the planet, doctors make these life or death decisions. I don't see why it would be unfeasible to not have a panel of some kind, and it could be, a 3, 5, whatever, but a panel to say, look, this crime has been so egregious. It has shocked the consciousness of the people so much. I'm sorry, but people that go out and do school shootings, I have no compunction about ending their lives, and not just for retribution, because I don't think it's for retribution. Is it to stop them from ever doing something like that again? And Jamie is kind of right in the fact that we don't have, I don't think, a system where we evaluate people of the propensity of their doing the crime ever again in the actual trial. I think that's later on through more of the appeal process, if I'm not mistaken, right? If you're up for a parole, then you're going to be evaluated. Are you still a threat to society? But through the actual, did you commit the crime? I don't know how much that is to take into account, but I think that people that demonstrate they have no remorse, no regret, and that might continue to have these patterns of destruction, then those are the ones they need to focus on. And like I said, we just allow a group of people that are trained in those things to do so.
And
So
what
can I
if
ask a
those
question?
people?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, what if those people determine that they believe something else is worthy of being put to death, right? I mean, let's say for you would agree that, sounds like serial murder, terrorism, maybe any murder, I'm not sure, you would have your list, right, of like the crimes that would justify those people assigning the death penalty. But what if they want to expand that and they've been given that power? What would stop them from doing that?
Well, the same reasons why we have the Supreme Court, right? I mean, there is an ultimate authority. When the Supreme Court says this is the way it is, it's the law of the land, they are empowered by the president to make that decision, right? The president decides who's going to be on the Supreme Court. We don't vote them in. There is a check and balance system, though. I think that maybe multi-tiered of some kind. There might be a local court that kind of puts it, maybe like a federal level or even state level, and then you have your appeal process. Because I don't think we should arbitrarily just say this person needs to die and then go ahead and do it. There should be an appeal process. There should be a checks and balance system where we know that this is the right thing that we're doing.
But didn't you say that the cost argument is only an argument because of the appeals, and if we cut down on that, then the cost argument wouldn't be a good one? But now you're using the appeals process to defend giving people the ability to decide who lives and who dies.
Well, there'd be a huge difference in cost between 20 years of appeals and a 3 system where you have an appeal process in maybe a year or two, right? You start at the state, go to the federal, and then you go maybe to the highest court if needs be. But we have appeal after appeal after appeal for decades on end. The criminals are always having appeal processes. So at that point, when you're at the end of the line, as Texas said, who was it that said something along the lines of when it comes to the death penalty, they're not trying to abolish it, they're making an express line for it. As Kyle had pointed out, how many people have actually been executed in the last decade or 20 years in most states on that are death row? It's nearly nominal compared to how many people have gone to death row, isn't it? It's a very small number.
It is, yeah. But that's not really an argument for or against the death penalty, right? Like the fact that it takes a while to execute people, that doesn't really tell us whether it's the right or wrong thing to do.
That's true. It's not. It doesn't decide morally whether it's right or wrong, but it goes to Jamie's argument is we need to change the system, and I could not agree with him more on that.
The problem with the reason the appeals take a long time is because there's just so many cases. I don't think there's no way to expedite it unless. This is a serious thing, deciding to kill someone. So the idea of we just expedite appeals, it's just not going to happen because the court system is overloaded and every case needs to be decided kind of on its timeline and on its merits. I don't know how you just shorten the appeals time,
No, I think
Good
it's a very
point.
fair point to make. Actually, you're exactly right. It is because the courts are overbooked. But again, this goes back to what Jamie said. Why are we punishing certain things that don't need to be criminally punished in the first place?
Agreed. Agreed.
You said something that I totally agree with. The drug war was abominable from the get-go. It was from its inception just flawed. It has been nothing but a travesty. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think everybody on here probably agrees with that. And just by fixing that alone would probably eliminate many of the problems. But I do agree that we should not have people that have 30 years in jail. What good is that anymore? What I'm telling you, as somebody
In
that
some cases, it
spent
probably
years in
saved
the
people
military,
that were innocent.
30,
I mean,
30 years?
think about it
Well,
that way.
I mean, not talking about the death penalty. Yeah, excluding the death penalty stuff. But people just have gone to, done petty crimes that got a decade or 20 years. That to me is just nonsensical. Absolutely nonsensical.
Casey, you had a question. You wanted to get in real quick?
Yeah, so my question is, if you have this list, and this is for anybody who wants to jump in, but as Steve made me think of it, if you have this list of crimes that are that warrant the death penalty, right? Would that be applied equally and objectively? Because right now, sentencing is not applied objectively. It's very subjective and based on pretty much whatever the judge wants to do that particular day. So would it be like a stringent list, black and white, this is what gets the death penalty and this is what doesn't?
I think the reason why you don't have consensus across all the jurisdictions is because they have this huge, wide spectrum of sentencing. Everything from 1 year to life. By narrowing it down significantly, I think it would force that type of black and white and uniformity with the jurisdictions. That's why I was saying is by capping it, you really force people to rethink. My point for capping, and maybe David, this is where I might have caused a misunderstanding here. My point for capping was not to say, yeah, let's do a lot more, executions. My point for capping was hopefully to actually minimize the number of executions, but make it a better option than it is today. Today, it's not a good option at all in any way, shape, or form. That's why I'm not for it at all right now. That's if that clarifies at all. I don't know if it does.
I mean, I guess aren't there so many crimes that we would probably all agree don't warrant the death penalty, but a 10-year sentence, 30% of which could be removed for good behavior or for prison crowding? Like neither one of those would be the right sentence.
I wouldn't do reductions. That's the point. So you get a 30-year sentence and then they're out in 15 years. It's like, okay, 5 years shorter. I mean, is it really making a big difference? 5 years isn't a
Fair
lot
enough.
of time.
Let me rephrase it then. Forget about the reductions of the behavior.
Yeah.
Wouldn't we all be able to identify crimes where the death penalty is too much, but 10 years on the nose is really not enough?
Oh,
sure.
I'm sure. Yeah, that's why I said. I mean, I was just throwing this out. That I told Kyle before I came onto the show that the idea was just to discuss this, just throw out some ideas and kind of cover every corner case. It wasn't for me to come on and say, David, you're wrong and I'm right, and let me prove it to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think in practice. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say he was putting out like a thought experiment for us to kind of base off of.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I think that, for me, the fundamental thing, there's always a question when you talk about this where my values are not the same as everybody else's, right? Like even everybody else on the panel or anybody else who has like a position on the death penalty. So oftentimes the conversation around it becomes about, based on the values of the person you're talking to, does the death penalty make sense or doesn't it make sense? So that's like where I said, if your big thing is cost, then you should be against the death penalty because it's more expensive than, for example, life in prison. That's not really my concern, right? Like for me, if you said, well, there's this thing that's more expensive, but it's hugely morally wrong, I wouldn't say, or it's less expensive rather, but it's hugely morally wrong, I wouldn't say, oh, well, we can save money. Like for me, that's not the top value. For me, really, the opposition to the death penalty comes in sort of two categories. One is that fundamentally, no justice system is perfect. So like very often we will hear from people, and even sort of like what you're saying, Jamie, which is if the system worked better, then you would be okay with, or you would be more open to the use of the death penalty. And I think that it's a thought experiment, but it's not that useful of one, because no system is ever perfect, right? Like most of the times airplanes don't crash, but no system is ever 100% perfect. So why would we even say in a system where planes never crashed, XYZ? And the reality is that we have innocent people on death row. We know that 1 out of 25 is one estimate, which is like 4%. We have mentally ill people on death row who don't even, based on psychiatric analyses, really even understand the consequences of the actions that led to them being on death row. You will have, fundamentally, we have a jury system in the United States, and whether it's the best system or not, we can debate, but it's not a perfect system. So given that we will never have a perfect system, like, isn't that reason alone, cost aside, deterrence factor aside, which we could talk about, wouldn't that be reason alone to say, you know what, we can undo life in prison? No matter what, like it's not an irreversible decision. People who are in life in prison without parole don't go on to kill other people. It's not, it could happen, but it doesn't. Isn't that good enough?
Well, it's kind of funny because when you were given the airline analogy, I wanted to quote Rain Man and say, "What about Qantas Airlines?" You seen that movie? No, nice. But so I kind of want to say two things at the same time. One was you brought up morality earlier, and then you also just mentioned innocent life. So is my question for you before I can answer you is morality to you the idea that an innocent life is taken, or just the fact that we're killing people for any reason whatsoever is the issue? Like, what is the moral issue about this with you?
The moral issue for me is based on my view about what it is that governments should and shouldn't do. I don't see any way to justify the government saying, here's a list of stuff for which we kill you.
Okay.
So it's not about a cost thing, because because I don't think it naturally follows that if we fix the cost thing, it would change your perspective on the death penalty, right?
Like I said, for me, I think if you care about cost, it's cheaper to do life in prison. That's not my priority, right? So like that was sort of if I'm talking to someone who says cost is the most important thing, I might mention that. But for me, that's not really the issue.
But that doesn't follow. I could say the cost is the most important thing. I support the death penalty, but we need to fix the cost. We need to fix the system to make it less expensive. Did everybody drop?
Yep, mine dropped. Yeah.
I thought so. Okay. We're sorry about that from the outside. We'll continue where we left off. I was just saying that it doesn't necessarily follow that if your goal is to reduce costs, that you have to be against the death penalty. The goal would then be, let's fix the situation where we're not spending so much, but keep the death penalty. So there's not an entailment there, right? Sure.
You could make that argument. I think that the ways you fix the cost issue cause new problems. Like, for example, you get rid of the appeals. 4% of the people on death row are innocent. So I think we need the appeals. So I think that there's a follow-up argument, which is if you want to fix the cost, how do you actually do it in a way that doesn't cause new problems? But like I said, for me, like I don't start arguing against the death penalty on the basis of cost, if that makes sense.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think that one of the biggest concerns I think everybody probably has when it comes to the efficacy of these things is what happens with an innocent person. That's to be a primary consideration, right? Unfortunately, people do get they go to jail and they're innocent. And so, of course, the people are going to be executed innocent. And I think Casey brought it up, is not fairly distributed by any stretch of the imagination.
When you get there. But here are the facts surrounding that. Number one, false informant testimony is the top cause of wrongful convictions in capital cases. Many people, I think, would think it would be DNA, but only 20 of the 150 death row exonerations have been due to DNA evidence. We can trust the he said, she said thing when somebody it's one person's testimony against another, and you're playing with something so important in someone's life. Like, how do you go about justifying that?
Well, let me ask you this: when was these done? Because obviously times have changed, right? And I don't think anything should be based on eyewitness testimony where somebody's life is at risk. That's just nonsense. But I think that because we have better
These
DNA
are as of
analysis now,
2016.
so some of the,
2016.
we still have eyewitness testimony putting people on death row.
Oh yeah.
That's a scourge.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, I'm
this
not
is
going to
actually
challenge
called
that,
the
but that is
CSI effect. There's this thing called the CSI effect where people expect that many more cases will be sort of resolved in this neat and tidy way where they come up and they've got the DNA evidence. That's it. It's sort of open and shut. And the majority of people in all crimes are not being convicted on the basis of DNA evidence. And I think what you said is really interesting, which is if nobody should be on death row on the basis of eyewitness testimony, that's almost everybody.
Yeah. I mean, so what do you say to that, Steve?
Well, I mean, again, what happens? What do you mean by eyewitness? If we have a camera, if I have a camera set up somewhere and it literally shows me shooting
That's
Jamie,
different.
and I don't know why I keep doing
Yeah.
Jamie. Jamie, I don't want you dead. Okay, just don't. It's
going on?
hypothetical. Okay? Yeah,
That's totally different.
I'm just
That's
looking your
all
way.
people.
Okay, okay.
I'm
So,
talking about a
I mean,
jailhouse snitch rolling over because the police went to him and he said, "Yeah, I saw so
Yeah, I
and
would be
so
very
on
much
the
against.
street corner that day."
I would be very
Yeah,
much
but that's
against that
the
kind of.
jailhouse snitch example is one, but most of the eyewitness testimony is not people who have a very obvious incentive to snitch, and
Sure,
even people in jail are not necessarily getting a deal if they make a claim like that. I think it's important to just remember most eyewitness testimony is just people who are pulled into the investigation in some way, shape, or form.
I
Right.
would go on a limb and probably say DNA is much better to exonerate than it is to convict.
In cases of exoneration, only 20 of the 153 death row exonerations have been due to DNA evidence. So, no. The
Well, again,
Yeah, I mean, the
again,
reason for that is that it's hard to prove a negative. Just because DNA evidence can create it can create circumstances which can
great
be
doubt.
used to propose how it might have happened. But someone's DNA could be somewhere for reasons unrelated to the crime. And just because their DNA isn't there isn't necessarily exculpatory either.
Yeah. Jamie?
No, I was to say like O.J. Simpson.
Oh, yeah.
No, I mean they literally had blood in the vehicle, and he said it was for a totally different reason.
I knew that was gonna. I knew at some point that was gonna come up. So
I'm not
if you're playing bingo.
Yeah, it was more to lighten the mood a little bit, but
no, it's a good point. I mean, it's a good point. Hey, look at the glove. I mean, that should tell you it. There's a statistic here that I wanted to cover. This was to me the glowing one, and it hit, I think, to what Steve was saying about the expediting the appeals process and making it quicker to execute someone, because 7 people were exonerated from death row in 2014, 3 in Ohio, 2 in North Carolina, and 1 in Louisiana. 6 of the 7 people that were exonerated happened 30 years after the inmate was locked up. So the scary thing is, if we had an expedited process, you would have 7 people that were executed wrongly, and that's 7 too many.
Well, not necessarily. Well, again, though, the way they convicted 30 years ago may not be the same that they would be doing it now. I mean, back then, people were convicted for a lot less evidence, and unfortunately, back then, if you were a member of a minority, you were much more likely to be convicted than if you were not. And I think so hopefully society has been growing since then and been changing, and where we don't have that institutionalized type thing. But unfortunately, again, like Casey said, it's not fair at the moment. And
is that true though? Like, I mean, is it true that people used to be convicted with far less evidence? I mean, let's put DNA aside for a second, but as Kyle said, DNA is not actually that big of a factor, at least in these death row cases that we're talking about. What evidence, I'm curious, what evidence is there that people used to be convicted on far less evidence?
Well, of course, it has to be more anecdotal than anything else, in my opinion. But I think that because we didn't have a lot of the methods we used to determine guilt from a crime, like the CSI techniques that you mentioned, we didn't have a lot of that.
But other than
DNA,
DNA,
so a lot of
CSI techniques are DNA. Like, other than the DNA element,
fiber analysis is still a very big thing in forensics, right? soil analysis, bacterial analysis. It doesn't have to be necessarily DNA. There's a lot of things where they say this person was at this scene because of these markers, or they had fibers or something along the lines of something other. Even just skin cells don't require a DNA analysis, right? So you can still determine.
Yeah, but a lot of that stuff's been around for a long time, and cases don't usually hinge just on that, you know? I mean, I'm open to what you're saying. I'm just saying I've not seen evidence that we're convicting people with more evidence necessarily right now.
Do you think back
I think
in
the greater question is, though, is it worth the risk? Like, isn't it a better fix to just hold them in prison for an indefinite amount of time, whether it be for life or, you know, until they're exonerated, rather than risking executing at least one innocent person?
Okay, so let's use my my idea that I had and replace death penalty with life sentence. Let's say I went 10 years or life sentence. What would you say to something like that? Just so I can hash out, you know, or get through the problems with this model. You know,
I think it's not enough gradation.
Okay,
I agree.
Okay.
Well, yeah. How do you get 10 years to life? Is not gradated very well. Sure.
It seems like there would be some crimes that, you know, didn't warrant. To me, the issue with it, the biggest issue with it, is there will be some crimes that don't warrant either. You know, like what would you do with the in betweens? And I think you would wind up getting into a kind of like what we have now, just judges that are arbitrarily, you know, imposing sentences. Another bad thing that we have is the mandatory maximum. I know that's a whole other debate, but, you know, all of that entire sector of the criminal justice system needs to be just overhauled. But isn't it worth the risk? Sorry,
Kyle.
Go ahead.
No, here's what I'm trying to say. This is why I support 10 years. I'm a 25-year-old kid who goes out and, you know, does, you know, I hold up a store with a gun and a round accidentally goes off and I unintentionally hit somebody in the leg or something and they still survive, but it was a bad situation. And normally they'd say that's a 30-year sentence. So I get out, you know, I'm 55 years old now. I got to start my life all over again, as opposed to getting out at 35 years and going, that was the stupidest thing I ever did. Give me a chance to get back and try, you know, try over again. Something like that.
Yeah, but you wouldn't get 30 years for that.
Some have.
Some places you do.
Yeah.
And
by the way, you haven't seen 25 in a decade.
Hold on, this is important though.
This was
it's a first-time offender, accidental, non-lethal shot to the leg, was it?
A guy who stole $1 million worth of fajitas got 50 years.
That is true.
I mean, we got to screw up justice system.
Hold on, but that case, that has nothing to do with guns now, right? That's just are these two separate cases?
Yeah, these are the guy literally stole out of a food truck $1 million worth of fajitas, and they said 50 years in prison.
Well, he didn't. What he did was he worked at a detention. Well, he worked at a detention center, and so what he would do was he ordered the food for the detention center, and he would order from this company extra cases of these fajitas, right? So then he would take those out to the street or whatever and sell those. Well, he ordered a shipment of them, and he didn't show up for work. He was sick that day.
Right.
So
I know the story too. But
they went back and they counted it up. He had $1 million worth of fajitas. The judge gave him 50 years. And I think what the ultimate what we need to see here out of this picture is that the issue is with our sentencing laws. If we were to overhaul those, I'm not sure.
I believe he was not.
They're fajitas. You know, he had to be Mexican. I didn't say that. I'm just kidding.
Come on.
Steve.
I like fajitas.
I like fajitas.
I do too. But
I
mean, listen. So I think this case. You know, this case has nothing to do with the death penalty, first of all. I think 50 years is crazy for that. But, you know, I think it is important to mention that.
David, I'm sorry, but at his age, it is a death penalty.
It is.
It's a life sentence.
In prison. Yeah, but I'm saying it's dying. He's dying in prison is my point.
Yeah. I'm not defending it's cartoonish to say that it was for fajitas and it sounds funny, but you're talking about a guy who was basically stealing taxpayer money. Skimming. It's conspiracy. I mean, this is it's not 50 years for me. I totally agree. But the point is sort of like a 10 years or life or 10 years in death, or it's not. I just don't think it's adequate for the complexity level of the world we live in.
Why do we
what
need
you're saying.
why do we need a prison sentence of any kind of long magnitude for a white collar type crime? I believe prison should be much more tailored for the violent offender. I mean, I think that there are ways. Well, let me finish. Let me finish. I think there are white collar things that there can be much more going for restorative type justice, and I think that many of these crimes that are committed don't require incarceration for 50 years. That person that stole the fajitas for all that money is no different than somebody stealing a candy bar when it comes to the efficacy of stealing. They're not going to harm society to the point where they're not taking somebody's. I beg to disagree.
But you're trying to compare somebody walking into a gas station and grabbing a candy bar to
someone stealing taxpayer money.
Well, yeah, and the system that he had to set up in order to do that, like he had to lie to people. He had to. I mean, he did steal. You're right, he did steal, but it was like a whole freaking like operation that he had going.
Oh, it's next level. Yeah, I'm familiar.
So it was a lot. It's not like walking into a gas station and stealing a candy bar.
But what is the restoration going on by putting him in prison? What are we trying to protect at that point? I mean, he can't.
That's a really
if he's not
good general.
Getting back the money would be more important, right? Paying back, giving back some of the money, and if they wanted to say, okay, this person needs to go into this program where they're doing community service for 20 years or something like that, put them in the almost like I hate to say the military type thing, but where they're giving back and they're paying back to the taxpayer. That to me is far more effective than putting in prison for 50 years, because they're not a threat to society of any magnitude against somebody that I'd rather have
to your earlier
prison,
points,
like a rapist or a murderer.
To your earlier point, though, Steve, you were talking about these sentences make an example of people. I know that people won't be stealing fajitas anymore if they work at detention centers.
And you know, the funniest part is the same thing when it comes to like the death penalty as a a deterrent. We all know isn't very effective. However, there are people that will not kill a cop because knowing they will be on the death row if they kill a cop. In that particular instance, I think
many states they
it does. Well, yeah, but in the states that have it, I think it does have an effect. I think there is something.
So you're saying that the states that have the death penalty have fewer cop homicides than states that don't have the death penalty?
No, I'm not saying they have fewer, but I think it doesn't be said that somebody's going to say, you know what, if I'm going to kill somebody, if the person is a cop, I think that people will probably take much more pause to make that decision than if they. And by the way, what's that?
I was just gonna say I can answer that. In a national survey in 2016 by all of the U.S. police chiefs, they had to rank what they considered to be priorities in terms of effective crime reduction. The death penalty was last in that ranking of.
Not for crime reduction. I said it. Yeah, no, I said it's not a very good preventive measure. I'm saying for that one type of crime, cop killing, I think it might be more effective than it not happening.
It's not. So here's the way this works. And I know you guys go for 2 hours, Kyle. I don't know if you remember, but I had about 45 minutes today. So I'm sort of getting to the end of my time.
I do remember. You're good.
Here's the thing about deterrence, and this is really, really important. The criminology data says that assuming that it is a, generally speaking, strict enough penalty, the exact potential penalty is not a very big deterrent. So let me give an example. Jaywalking. If the penalty for jaywalking is $2 versus $100, there's very little deterrent effect from having it be $100 rather than $2. What does make a really big difference in terms of whether people will jaywalk or whether they won't is how likely is it that they'll get the penalty at all, right? So if it's $2 and the cops are regularly giving people that penalty, that's a deterrent. If it's $100 and people are regularly getting that penalty, it's equally a deterrent. So what we find out when we look at the data is that when you consider something like cop killing, because that's the example, if the options are, if I kill a cop, I might get life in prison, or if I kill a cop, I might get the death penalty, the deterrent is how likely you are to be caught, which is why in countries with high levels of corruption, where gang crime and killing and murder are less likely to be punished at all, you see more of it. In the United States, both the death penalty and life in prison are strict enough, and it's likely enough that you will get arrested and caught, that the difference between one and the other has zero deterrent effect.
Yeah, I agree. Enforcing of laws is important. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he said anything I would totally disagree with. I think that there is something to be said by the degree of measure by which we're going to be punishing somebody, whether it's a small ticket or large ticket, doesn't have a significant factor on people's decision to break the law. I totally agree with that. Yes.
But
Okay,
I think when you made the point about it, do we have a perfect system? And you said it's irrelevant to talk about it. What you're describing is irrelevant as well, because no system enforces all of the laws equally. They pick and choose
No,
what
it's
they
the
want to
likelihood though.
enforce.
I mean, you're right. You're never going to get it exactly. But the point
Right, if it was.
there's a 10% chance you'll get caught for murder versus a 70% chance. Like the 70 is enough, right? That's what we're saying. It doesn't have to be 100.
And David, you're getting, I think, up to your time. I don't know how much time you have left exactly.
Yeah, I've sort of got to go. The conversation has been really, really good, but I sort of allotted some certain amount of time, and I've got people waiting for me.
You did? Absolutely. And we appreciate you coming on. We'll let you wrap up any last thoughts that you have, and then we're still going to stay on, everybody, so we're going to continue this conversation. But I do want to thank you, David, for coming on and giving us your point of view.
No, thanks for having me. Great to hear everybody's views, and I really appreciate the interest in having me on.
Absolutely. Take care, David.
Best of luck with everything.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Yeah, this was a very good
Thanks.
conversation, by the way, David. I was very
It was
impressed.
nice to meet you.
And he's already gone.